Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming along this evening, and thank you all around the world for joining us. You're very welcome. As you know, this is part of our Bletchley Park Week, which we hold every week. I hope some of you got a chance to take the coach trip down to Bletchley Park on Sunday. It is amazing. Bletchley Park is developing very impressively year after year. If you missed Sunday's trip, don't worry, because we'll do another one this time next year, so you can join us then. Now, this talk is being given by Professor Rosario Taddeo, who's extremely well qualified, as you can see from the descriptions there, to talk about the theme that we chose for this year's Bletchley Park. We can choose a different theme each year, sometimes specifically cybersecurity, something like that, sometimes history. Next year will be women, actually, because the majority of people at Bletchley Park were women, and several of our fellow students are interested currently in the topic of women and AI. But this year's topic is ethics, so we're extremely fortunate to have Professor Taddeo in Oxford at the Oxford Internet Institute researching on the ethics of cyber warfare, and particularly fortunate to have her speaking with us this evening, and afterwards there will be time for questions and answers and discussion, so do feel free to keep your questions to ask at the end. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I should say that I'm a bit nervous for two reasons. I understood this talk was after drinks, so you were supposed to be much more relaxed. And I have also students and members of my department in the room. So if I do this in a bad way, it's going to stay with me forever. So pretend it's going to be fantastic if things do not work out as a favor. Can you hear me just right? All right. Okay, so we have 45 minutes to talk about the ethics of cyber warfare. It's a topic I'm very much attached to, and I think it's a topic that kind of comes to mind when you think about Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park is famous for two things: Turing, which brings about topics like artificial intelligence, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, about also the development of digital, computing, ICTs, depending which generation you belong to, technologies, in relation to national defense and warfare. So I thought it was a good occasion to explore these three themes: artificial intelligence, technologies, and warfare, going through the analysis of the ethical implications of cyber warfare. So it's 40 minutes. What we're going to do is, starting with the digital revolution. I want to tell you about this in terms of not so much the technological advancement that we're all very familiar with, but the conceptual, if you allow me, philosophical implications of the changes brought about these technologies. I am a philosopher as a background and as a way of living, so philosophy will be front and central to this talk. Then we'll talk about cyber warfare, and then artificial intelligence, and then I'll leave you with a message. Any point you're bored, you can disconnect, as long as you connect back with the message at the message point. So I'll flag it up, because that's the message I really want to get across, and it's important you are with us at the moment. So what is the digital revolution? This is a phrase that has become very popular. You will hear it everywhere. It's not just in Oxford, it's not just in the department. We were discussing a few minutes ago how a few years ago, if you proposed a PhD topic on ethics and digital technologies, ethics and ICT technologies, as it is when I did it, people would look at you in a very weird way. I mean, Andrew is here, like the whole ethics and technology has taken time to take root. But now the digital revolution is here. The pandemic has helped us recognizing the capillary adoption of these technologies, and to make us realize also that we depend on these technologies as societies and as individuals to work and function. Someone will say that we depend in a kind of a unreflexive way. We have an expectation to be able to depend on these technologies. So far. Oh, please come in. Come in. Uncontroversial. But the digital revolution, as I was saying, prompts changes in our world in two ways. Operational, we do things in different ways. I'm giving a talk here in Oxford, but there are people around the world who are listening to it or might listen to it later on. I have a family in Italy where we interact much more than we would have done 10 years ago. Write essays, it's been like first year last year that in Oxford we stopped writing that by hand and we allow students to do exams using keyboards. Things have changed. But it's not just that. The operational changes are prompting conceptual changes. It's changed the way we understand things. I'll ask you a question, breaking the tradition. When I say real, what comes into mind when you think about something real? An object which is tangible, right? Something that this remote control, this computer. And when I say virtual, can I ask just the students to ask? What's virtual? Is he real or is he unreal? Is virtual a synonym of unreal or is he synonym of something else? And somebody has to answer.
It's both real and unreal.
Unreal and real, so pictures on the cloud are real or unreal?
They exist, but only in a certain way.
So it's a change in the way we understand the world. Reality has become to mean not just tangible, but interactable. Independently of whether I can perceive it with my touches, it's something that exists. It's a big shift. In the philosophy department, they will say is a re-ontologization, is a way in which we redefine what exists. So it's a conceptual, it's a philosophical revolution. The two things together means that through the digital revolution, we're changing the environment around us because we design the environment, the architectures of the buildings, of the street, of the schools, of the hospital, so that digital technologies work better. But also, it's changing the way in which we understand the environment and we interact with it. Conceptual and operational. Why is it important? Well, because this reorganization, this redesign, is something that changes profoundly the reality around us. Now, my mentor and a philosopher who was in Oxford, has been in Oxford for 30 years and left us for Yale, lucky them, will tell you that the digital, Luciano Floridi, the digital cuts and pastes reality in the sense that it couples, decouples, or recouples features of the world and our corresponding assumptions about them. Reality has become a play or a game of this type. Two examples, war and AI. As a human species, as a human genre will say, we have been quite despicable in this world for millennia, and we've been waging war forever. A few thousand years ago, we started to regulate war. And how we did it? Well, we understand war as an adversarial or aggressive behavior which is delivered through the use of force. And to regulate war, we regulate the use of force. This is what just war theory, international humanitarian laws, and laws of war are for. Fast forward 2,000 years, so 2007 years, to the attacks, the Russian attacks against Estonia, and a new type of war happens, where we decouple the concept of aggressive behavior from the one of force. There is a new type of war where you can be aggressive, you can do damage, but you don't use any physical violence. How do we regulate this new type of war? If all the regulations we have had so far, they were looking at the use of violence, at the use of force, and now we're not using that anymore. Artificial intelligence. Should do a premise here. There was a fantastic lecture delivered yesterday by Jeff Hinton as the Romanes lecture on AI. Brilliant lecture, up to one point, when he mentioned superintelligence and the big alignment problem. I'm not going to do sci-fi today, so it's not about science fiction, it's not about superintelligence when we talk about AI, but there is an important shift there as well. Because before Turing, and also to quote Turing, we thought that intelligence was an agency able to interact with the environment to achieve a goal with intention. After Turing, when we opened to the question whether machine can think, we understood that you can have a form of agency into the environment which can achieve goals with no intentionality. It's this decoupling that also changes the way in which we understand us as humanities and interact with the environment. But please, when I say AI, I know AI and warfare, it opens the floor for a lot of sci-fi questions. Don't ask them to me, because I really, really, really forget all the British attitude I learned in 20 years, and I get full Italian about how radically wrong is to ask those questions. Turing said the question whether machine think is not worth asking. So we know this from the beginning. The rest has been like just, let's say, popular culture. So what about cyber warfare? Why is it relevant? In this coupling and decoupling, while we redesign concept, redesign the environment, understand new things or understand all things in a new way, there is hidden a lot of potential and a lot of risks. It's the ethical game. Ethics is not about forbidding. It's about understanding risks and benefits and trying to find a trade-off, a balance. And cyber warfare has a lot of positives and a lot of risks as well. They can only be understood whether we understand properly the nature of this phenomenon. One way of understanding it is to think, well, there is the physical space, the physical domain, the tangible one, and then there is the cyber, the virtual one. Hi, come in. And then in this domain, we wage conflicts, and we have the physical, and we have the digital. And so you have physical agents, physical targets, and to do conflict in this context, you have to have a little bit of violence or a lot of violence, depending on the situation. And then on the other side, we have the cyber. So we have digital agents, digital targets, and yes, there can be violence because a cyber attack can lead to the destruction of things. But generally speaking, there is no real destruction, there is no real violence, there is no use of force. Fine. How do we regulate this new phenomenon where everything is cyber, everything is separated from the analog or physical world? The approach that has been pushed forward for the past 20 years is based on analogies. Or we need good analogies which allow us to interpret existing ethical theories, existing international regulations, so that they will fit to the case of this new phenomenon, a war that happens without force. It's an approach which has been pushed not just in academia, but into relevant policy fora, the NATO, the UN, particularly, let's say, US-centered approach have been fostering this idea of analogies with existing regulations so that we can interpret new phenomena in old ways. And that's where you need a philosopher to tell you that that's the wrong approach. Why? Well, consider this. This is the Tallinn Manual. The Tallinn Manual has been this big manual on how to interpret international regulations, international humanitarian laws, and law of armed conflict, so that we know what to do in the case of cyber. This is a quote from the first edition. Second edition was not updated. I hope the third one corrects on these sorts of mistakes. But one of the key questions when it comes to regulating cyber warfare is, how do we respond to a cyber attack? If a state A attacks state B, what does state B does? Well, let's go and look at, for example, international humanitarian law. And what's the answer of the Tallinn Manual? Well, they say, well, if a cyber operation has some sort of effects, then it should be considered a cyber attack. And then, just to give you an example, Article 5 of NATO is triggered, and the alliance is in the right to defend itself. So they say a cyber attack amounts to an armed attack when it is a cyber operation, whether offensive or defensive, that is reasonably expected to cause injury, death to person, or damage or destruction to objects. Fine. Spot on. If a cyber attack causes any of these damages, it should be treated as an armed attack. We want to defend ourselves, because a cyber attack in this case is nothing but a destructive attack operated through digital means. But that's not the question we were asking. The question is, how do we regulate all those other attacks which stays below the kinetic threshold? So kinetic is a way of describing conventional war, when you destroy things. And so non-kinetic or cyber is an attack which is aggressive, but doesn't cause the destruction of something or the death of someone or casualties in the population. This is the question we want to answer. And the mind frame does not allow to do that, because what it does is to force new phenomenon, cyber warfare, into an old category. Now, if you're a philosopher, this is like chalk on the blackboard. It's a total violation of radical thinking, but it's not of correct thinking. It's not just that. is that when you look at the future from the rear mirror, when you look at the future considering only categories that you're very familiar with and coming from the past, you missed the opportunities and you miss understanding the nature of what you're looking at now. So cyber warfare has changed the way we do war, also in terms of strategy and tactics. Now this is a fortress. We don't also wage war anymore through fortresses, but it's a good example. A fortress in defense has two functions. It keeps secure the people inside. Sorry, I'm not getting moved, I've just been talking for too long. It keeps secure people inside, but also defends from attacks coming from the outside. It fences off attacks. So you have two functions in one object. When you look at cyber, this is not true anymore. In cyber defense, when a cyber threat arrives, it triggers two responses. You have cybersecurity, which is becoming a way of engineering systems so they are robust and resilient. So they don't crumble immediately once attacked. But it's an engineering problem. And then you have cyber defense, which in the cyberspace has become a way of retaliating, offending. The US will say defend forward. If you like the expression, I find it a little bit hypocritical, but that's the sense. Defense in cyber has nothing to do with fencing off attack in terms of security. It's about making sure that the opponent understands our strengths, and for that is deterred. Why is this? Well, this is because cyberspace has different strategic characteristics than other sorts of domains of war. When you launch a non-kinetic cyber attack, so a cyber attack which targets a digital infrastructure, doesn't destroy the infrastructure, but for example, destroy the data, ransomware attack, just to give you an example. Those attacks are easier to launch than any other type of attacks for two reasons. Attribution is very problematic. We're getting better, but we do not attribute with absolute certainty. And if you cannot attribute with absolute certainty, it's very difficult to punish the attacker. It's not just that. There is no such a system, digital system, that is bulletproof. The moment a system is connected online, and even if it's not connected online, as the Iranian nuclear centrifuges show, the system will be liable to be attacked. It's a matter of time, but there is no such a system that it cannot be attacked. So if you attack, you have the advantage that sooner or later, you might be successful, and most of all, you're never going to be caught, or you are unlikely to be caught. This makes cyberspace an offensive, persistent environment. It means that offense and defense are in constant contact because the offense has no disincentive not to attack. It's different from other domains where attacking is so difficult that the very idea this kind works as a deterrence of attacking. Because of these two things, cyberspace has become a weaponized environment where capabilities are used in an adversarial way one against the other. And this creates a kind of a vicious circle, which, just to give you an example, in international context, for example, it spirals the so-called security paradox. Because every capability in cyber can be used in an adversarial way, if I realize the state A is increasing its digital capabilities, I suspect that it is increasing digital capabilities to attack me later on. So what do? I increase my digital capabilities, so I am able to respond to those attacks. And it starts a paradox where digital supports and fosters instability and not the opposite. This dynamic does not only occur, let's say, among criminals or terrorists or non-governmental groups. It's something where state actors are particularly active these days. And this is an important focus because when we talk about regulation, when we regulate these dynamics in context of crime, or when we regulate these dynamics in context of international warfare, there are different criteria and different norms to respect. So the actors we are looking at is quite important. Now, I don't say that state actors are involved because I have, let's say, evidence of undisclosed knowledge or information, but because it's open in the public. So the UK, it was about 10 years ago, launched the so-called active cyber defense. A few years later, that was not successful. Now we have an Office for Offensive Cyber within the MOD, which does offensive cyber. Russia, well, needs no presentation, no introduction. They're quite good at this. They supported the all full-scale Ukraine invasion with cyber activities up to today. The US, of course, they have the defense forward attitude and strategy, which has been there for over a decade. Israel has been leading this set of skills and attitudes as well, and NATO. NATO can now rely on the offensive capabilities of its member to retaliate against cyber attacks. So everybody is participating in this context. But remember, we don't have the regulations because we're looking at this through the lenses of conventional or kinetic warfare. So none of these attacks is actually regulated because all these attacks are below the threshold. Point is that not in our societies, not having a physical damage does not mean that there is no damage. Because data, for example, are very important to us. I'll give you an unconventional example because it concerns Russia as a target of an attack and not as an attacker for once. But still, it's very important, I think. A few days ago, a group of a Ukraine team called the Bo team, if I'm not wrong, they attacked a server which stored data from a Russian satellite, which are used for usually climate and weather prediction, and of course in this context they're also used for warfare. The attack caused the loss of 2 peta of data. It's a huge amount of data. Now, in the context of warfare, you might consider that proportionate, legitimate, and so on and so forth. But it's a huge loss for society because those data could be used also for research on climate change. So it is not true that there is no damage. There is just a damage to something which is not tangible. And we let this to happen over and over without having enforced any regulation on this context. There are 3 sets of problems that comes from this lack of regulation to cyber warfare. I call them, without no imagination, the 3R problems, so sorry about. The first one is about risks. I was mentioning the security paradox a few minutes ago. There is a risk also that because cyberspace is such an offensive, persistent environment, that conflicts, attacks start to escalate. And perhaps one of these attacks might become too impactful. The other part might feel too much damage has been perpetrated, and so responses might start to escalate. And this could be, it's not a trigger for the end of the world, but it's a trigger for an escalation of a crisis, which in this context is quite problematic. There is a matter of rights. Every digital infrastructure in society is a target. So one of the responses is, well, let's increase the surveillance and the monitoring on this infrastructure so that we know when an attack is in. There are Israeli companies that are able to track the way we type on our keyboards, so the way we use our mouse to identify users and make sure that no malicious user is in our system. So the protection starts to infringing or to put under a lot of pressure our rights, fundamental rights. And then there is an issue of responsibility. Without even touching AI, we're going to get there in a moment, but when we start to have machines which act very quickly in an adversarial environment, if something goes wrong, how do we attribute responsibility or liability, so even be less just in the legal context, for the actions of these machines? So this is the scenario where we're coming in. And all this just because we refuse to look at reality. There is no dichotomy between cyber and analog. The Ukraine war, if anything, it has shown that digital societies wage digital war. It's a digital warfare. You have humans and you have machines. You have robots and soldiers. You do no physical damage, you have the risk of a mass destruction. We have to regulate the whole system in a consistent way. We cannot just keep looking with old categories to something which is so radically different from what it was a few years ago. Now, in all this, we throw in the fantastic, mighty AI. You cannot have a talk these days without AI. So, as I say, no science fiction in this room. Superintelligence is not a topic. Alignment issues, not a topic. Not what I'm going to talk about. But what it is, AI. Now, it's a name for a category of technologies. This is an old taxonomy. It's 6 years ago and it's already outdated. But it gives you a sense of the different types of AI, whether it's symbolic, sub-symbolic, statistic, it's robotics, it's neural networks. It's a lot of things. But all these things have one element in common. We could define AI as a growing resource of interactive, autonomous, self-learning agency, which can be used to perform tasks that would otherwise require human intelligence to be executed successfully. That's a lot of words. It's a definition that happens in two parts. The first part is the Turing test. We're not looking for something intelligent. We're looking for something which behaves as if it was intelligent. It does my job with no intelligence. ChatGPT. You ask her to write this source of slides? Precisely. No intelligence. Well, spot on. That's the point. So intelligence is not within it. It's the imitation of intelligence. But that's not the key part. The key part is the previous three adjectives. It's agency, which is interactive, autonomous, and self-learning. These are the three seeds of all the potential of AI is. And there is a lot of potential of AI. We can analyze genomic data. We can analyze climate change data. We can understand the mechanism of Alzheimer's and cancer, all thanks to this wonderful technology, and the ethical challenges that are there. Now, what are the ethical challenges? Ethics of AI is an old in disguise discipline because it started in 1950s with the work of Wiener. So it's not something super new, but it's become popular, and we have discussion and talks like this after 2012 with AlexNet and the new summer of AI. So this kind of summarizes the previous 10 years of research in this topic. There are 5 macro ethical challenges that AI poses. You find them in the baby blue square circles. It's about enabling human wrongdoing. I only need to say bias for you to know what I mean. So when AI does something that we will do wrong, but it does it on a larger scale in a more efficient way. Reducing human control is a technology that is not transparent. So I give it an input, it gives me an output, but I cannot understand how the output was produced. So I cannot challenge it. I might not know whether it's wrong or correct output. It's not just that. It has a very, well, depending on the model, but low level of predictability. There is no absolute certainty about the output of a system once you deploy it. So imagine implementing one of these systems on a weapon, and then you leave it on a battlefield. So you're going to be sure that it's going to be able to shoot only that target, or it's going to invent something new. ChatGPT hallucinates every day, so it's no different. Then there is the idea of responsibility. Now, moral responsibility is a complex beast, I would say, but one element which we know is very important is intentionality. You can only be morally responsible for the actions you do in an intentional way. But if I have a machine who does something that I could not predict once I designed and developed it, can I be responsible for those actions if I never intend them? So it's a big issue. And then there is devaluing human skills. There is a lot of debate about the impact of AI on the job market. Are we going to be all out of job in a few years' time? What happens to car driver, to scholars, to artists? I'm not going to touch that because modeling the job market is very, very complex, and there are so many variables, so many externalities. I don't even know how you can even start to think about that. But I would ask another question. Why we delegate tasks? We need to make sure that we don't lose the skills. I want doctor to, be able to read an MRI and understand when something goes wrong, even if it's an AI that does it every day. Because the AI does it more efficiently, and the doctor can do other things. But when the AI makes a mistake, we need to be able to recognize it and intervene. So it's the skill, it's not the job that we should be focusing on. And then there is the self-determination. All of us, more or less, in different level, but we're all susceptible to the so-called tech bias. I mean, we are in a British audience, so if I say the computer say no, at least some of us know what I mean. It's the idea that if a machine tells you X, you're going to say X. It was a famous and very sad case a few years ago when sat-navs started to be popular, of a bunch of young people who were driving in Australia. Apple Maps was telling them, go straight, go straight, go straight. And they were ignoring the signals that were indicated there was a canyon. And tragically, they all fell into the canyon. That's the level we trust machine. We forget about our ability to make choices. So we have to understand how to implement machines without eroding our self-determination. Why is this so relevant for cyber warfare? Is this actually talking about something completely impossible? Not really, because I'll tell you in a minute that AI in warfare and defense is not just about what you're thinking about, autonomous weapon systems. That's coming, but that's not the deal. AI is being implemented in decision-making processes throughout the fence, from how many bottles of water we need to buy this month for our personnel, up to the target in Gaza. So this is why all these 5 circles are very relevant when we think about not just warfare, but defense. And then there are these 2 red circles. I'll be back to this in a minute. I'm looking for time. Oh, you're not moving, so I'm okay. So when did we start to look at AI in the context of cyber? This is a GIF from a very important moment in the history of defense and cyber defense. It comes from what is called the Cyber Grand Challenge. It's a challenge that DARPA, which is the research part of the DoD in the US, organizes every now and then. And this was the 2016, and it's a watershed moment because these are the graphics. This is the graphics of 7 AI systems which are able to complete a strategic game called Capture the Flag. So each system was identifying its own vulnerabilities and patching them, identifying the vulnerabilities of the other 6 systems, and strategize when to attack with them. Super complex game. The potential of AI to do attacks. I was reading today an article that shows that LLMs, so ChatGPT for example, can scan the internet, scan websites, identify vulnerabilities, and attack them. So 10 years ago, more or less, for something that now all of us have on our keyboards, and it's quite scaring. So as I said, it's not just about cyber. AI is adopted transversally throughout defense and security. It goes for sustainment and support, so support for back office operation, logistics, and intelligence. All the data we've been producing on the web for the past few decades, they're part of what's called OSINT. It's an open source intelligence movement, thanks to AI. I think some of us in this room are old enough to remember when Prisma, the scandal of the NSA, was uncovered, Snowden case for the younger one. Obama's response was, it's okay, we have the data, but we cannot analyze them. So, it's fine. First of all, it's not about US citizens, so only the rest of the world can have their privacy violated. But then we don't know how to read this data, so it's okay even if we have it. Now it's not an issue anymore. Then there is aggressive, non-kinetic cyber uses, so cyber, artificial intelligence to respond to attack, to strategize offensive tactics, and to develop and release malware, as I mentioned before. And then you have the old little autonomous weapon system part, and the use of AI also to make decisions in the battlefield. Israeli gospel being the latest example of this. So it's not just about autonomous weapon system, it's also when you have the decisions to use force, which is aided by AI systems. In this talk, as we said, we'll focus only on the middle part. But the point is that you might remember the circle of spiraling cyberspace. When you throw AI into it, things get much, much more complicated because you have an autonomous agent which is ideally optimized to be aggressive, ideally optimized to be effective and efficient, which you do not control 100%. And worst comes to the worst, you cannot attribute either the attack or the responsibility if things get out of hands there. So the issue of control is one of the last issues I want to focus on in this case. You remember there were the 2 red circles, control and escalation. The naive view when it comes to control and AI is that, well, it acts so quickly and is so efficient and it will be so all over the place that there is no other chance we can control it. And there can be unforeseen consequences and we have a responsibility gap. Oh my God, what's happening? All fine, all correct. That's the tip of the iceberg. Because in all this, we're forgetting that AI is a very fragile technology. It's quite vulnerable. The robustness of AI is such a problematic issue that colleagues in computer science will tell you that it's computationally untractable. You cannot even begin to do the math. And if you start, it won't end. Why is it related to the issue of control? Because with AI, we have learned that we have developed new types of attacks. Cyber attacks so far, until 5 years ago, 6 years ago, were designed to disrupt systems. I take your data, I do a ransomware so you don't have access to your data anymore. I block your machines, I overheat them. So it was about creating a disruption. With AI, we have changed level. Attacks against AI systems are run to control the systems, to make the system behave in a different way. So you can do a data poisoning. You feed the system a very tiny little amount of erroneous data, and that will change the way the system behaves. Famous studies show that you feed an AI system 7% of erroneous data, and the system was used to distribute drugs in a hospital. 81% of the drugs or the patients got the wrong type of drug. 7%, 81%. Categorization model. It takes 1 pixel in a neural network to get a rifle for a turtle. Now imagine attacking an image recognition system mounted on a drone. 1 pixel. And backdoors. You only need a trigger, so something which is hidden in the parameters of the network, the neural network, that the machine might see at some point somewhere, and that changes immediately the behavior of the system. And the point is that because there is no source code, if the attacker is good, the behavior of the system will change just enough for the attacker to achieve their goal, but not enough for you to realize that the system is being compromised. So AI is becoming a huge Trojan horse that we are implementing throughout our infrastructures, and which we don't control for all the reasons related to autonomy, but mostly because it's not robust. And then there is an issue of escalations, which I touched on. I know it's becoming very tense. An issue of escalation, which goes back to the security paradox I was mentioning before, and to the fact that it's a capabilities that defense forces want to acquire to maintain their competitive advantage, but this due diligence is still not there to ensure full control of the technology. Now, this is the message moment, so everybody back. There is a good aspect of it, of this story. What two good aspects? It can really help defense to become stronger. And I'm sorry for the pacifists in the room. We need defense to be stronger. It cannot be, we cannot be on the weaker side of this competition, which is coming, unfortunately. But also, we can control the way AI will make defense stronger. How? With ethics. Now, there is a conflict of interest I need to acknowledge before going forward. What follows is part of a research project which has been funded by the Defence Science and Technology Laboratories of the Ministry of Defence in the UK, and I am an advisor to the Ministry as I'm part of the ethics advisory panel of the MOD. Having said that, hopefully this won't change or hasn't changed the way I approach this topic. So AI ethics, what have we done in the past 12 years? Some of us have been very busy writing AI ethics principles. There was a review written by some colleagues in 2018 that counted 88 set of AI ethics principles. It's a huge number. I mean, there are not possible 88 institutions focusing, or public institutions focusing on AI ethics. This is a map that kind of does the same thing, mapping what AI ethics principles are out there and also indicating the recurring themes. And defense institutions have known be strangers to this area. So at some point in 2019, the US came up with the principles, the UK came up with the principles. With my work, I helped them to inform these 5 principles, and then NATO also a few years later. Now, these principles have a lot of things in common. First of all, there are more than 5, either 5 or more than 5, which for a philosopher is a little bit traumatizing because we like to do things in 3. So we have at least 2 more, and that's a little bit annoying. But there is another element. They're quite general, and sometimes they are generic. When I first read the US principles and then the NATO principle, and also UK one, if you read them with a critical eye, they tell you AI has to be governable. So, wait a minute, did you use it and it was not governable? Or it has to be lawfulness? Because we use it as an illegal means so far. Why do you have to say this kind of obvious thing? So they're not precisely spot on, but they give you an indication. And this is also the good element. These are foundational principles. They are kind of like constitutional principles, profound and general, sometimes generic, but the idea is that they cover any possible use, any possible intention of use. They've been criticized for being so generic, for so high level. People have said, well, there is no guidance in these principles. What does it mean for AI to be human-centric? What does it mean for AI to be, again, equitable when you're doing defense? So more needs to be done. The criticism is fair, but only in part, because these principles are not there to indicate specific things. They are like a compass. They tell you the direction. They don't tell you how to get there. For that, we need a map, and we do need a map. The point is who and how does draw the maps, because that's the key element. When you have these kind of principles and you want to apply them to specific contexts, what you do is to translate them. You translate the principles into tools, for example. You say, well, there is a principle of transparency. A way of implementing the principle is to do an audit of your system, so that we have a tool, an audit tool, that tells us what steps are transparent, where you could be more transparent, where you can be less transparent. But this translation is normatively loaded, as every translation. It's full of normative choices. I'll give you an example, and then I'll go to this into more details. When you do audit, you can do audit through quantitative or qualitative metrics. Depending on one or the other, you focus on different variables. And so depending on the variables, you implement the principles in different way. Which variables do you choose? It's a normative choice. And who makes that decision? So these are the questions we are answering now in AI ethics. Why is it important? Well, it's important because when you do interpret principles, you need first to interpret their spirit. A principle of transparency, just to give you an example, can be interpreted in terms of transparency of the technology, but also traceability of the process. Which of the two? Both? One? The other? Which of the two choices we should go for? And it's not just that. When you interpret a principle, you need to balance it with other sets of principles, which are being used by a defense, for example, organization. The principle of transparency can come into conflict with the principles of national security, because not everything can be out there in the open. How do we balance these principles? What are the criteria? What are the principles? What are the hierarchy that we want to follow on? And who decides it? And it's not just that. The principles need to be balanced among each other. Being transparent and being robust might mean opposite things. So which of the two, again, we're going to go for? These are important questions because we're talking not about the use of AI in a commercial, personal context. This is a high-risk level context or domain. And the results have an important impact on our societies. What's in discussion when we implement these principles are the legitimate and conflicting interests of our society. We need to balance these principles so that the rights of the non-combatants, but also the rights of the defense forces and the interests of the tech providers need to be balanced off. And that's the work of ethics. It's where you trying to balance legitimate but conflicting interests. Why is this so important in this context? Because what's happening right now, I'll be quick in this part, is that we're producing the tools, but we're not focusing on the translation. And what's happening in reality is that a Ministry of Defense might say, well, we have the principles. This is a very nice policy unit of fantastic civil servants that we have in our department. Let them do the implementation. And this is what I call the ethics devolution, because you discharge the responsibility of creating a process which is independent, multi-stakeholder, transparent and scrutable, so done with a methodology that you can repeat, onto civil servants which are not representative of the interest of society, might not have the expertise to do their job. And this is very problematic because I think in the UK you would say this approach misuses ethics. I would say it abuses ethics because it's using ethics to create norms that have no legitimacy, either moral or regulatory. And so it just continues to maintain this kind of regulatory vacuum or gap that we have. So the message, and just to sum up, the digital revolution is a way of redesigning reality. Not just the world, not just the way we think about it. Reality, us in the world. War and society have a crucial role in this context because the way we wage war is a benchmark for the values of our societies. And these are the societies that we are redesigning. Ethics in this context can drive, should drive the discussion in terms of how do we redesign reality. But ethics is not public debate, ethics is not regulation, and should never be confused one with the other. because otherwise we undermine from the start the debate and the discussion to design open, pluralistic, just and tolerant post-digital societies. All this is not for us today. We're planting the seeds of what happens in 10, 15, 30 years. We have a duty to do it right, and ethics should never be abused in the process. Thank you so much. Shall I get the other mic? All right, thank you.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. Hope some of you got to see the Imitation Game, which was shown last night, the film about Alan Turing, which of course was sort of why we thought about this topic. It was very early days AI. It was, at least they did develop the world's first programmable digital computer, Colossus, to help them break the codes. And there were one or two things which happened in that film which were very relevant to what you're saying. But your final point about it does make these technologies do help you in fighting wars, and in that case, obviously, people watching the film are all behind Alan Turing and the other people at Bletchley Park trying to break the codes. But there was one bit which, of course, was completely inaccurate. It was just Hollywoodization to make the film more gripping. But when they finally broke the code, they immediately thought, should they warn the people on this ship or not? Now, firstly, that's not how it works in society. Those people aren't involved in those decisions. Those go up to somewhere in London, up to some bureaucracy or whatever, which raises the question about who should be making these decisions. But then it all. Secondly, on the ethics, it does leave that ethical decision for someone to make about, do you warn the people on the ship so they won't be killed, even though if you warn them, the other side will then know that you've broken their code, and you may want to keep it for bigger things, which was a sort of ethical dilemma in the film, which was quite gripping. But anyway, throw it open to the floor. Any questions, observations, comments? Yeah, the back there.
Hello, this was a fantastic talk. My name is Tommy Hall. I'm currently a Marshall Scholar in the Diplomatic Studies program and a First Lieutenant in the United States Army. I have a question right now about the potential for bifurcation of ethics. We've talked about realistic competition that can exist. I know that in one of my previous lectures we talked about now we're entering a world of like 3 different methods for internet governance, which the European model is different from the US model, which is different from the Chinese model. Do you see a bifurcation of ethics to where you could have different ethical models that coexist inside of this world, and what are the implications of that?
Thank you. I think when it comes to defense ethics or military ethics, there is an advantage than when you do this in other sorts of domains, because the values that should inform the conduct in defense or in war, whatever domains of war we're talking, they are coded into just war theory and international humanitarian law. The point is to evolve the thinking so that we can focus on the issues that we have these days. But there is no different set of values that we should consider. The bifurcation is going to happen between those who follow the values and respect the values and those who don't. But that's a bifurcation that we already have. But I think that sometimes it's discouraging, because it feels that the side of those who don't follow the values is growing and the other one not. But that's a different business. But one thing I want to say is that when I give this type of talks, one of the questions is, why should we care about ethics if the opponent doesn't? Which is a fair question. I mean, the answer is a little bit idealistic, but it's important that we stress it. If we start embedding these technologies into defense, and from the start we violate our own values, there's no point in doing defense anymore. We might just as well surrender, because we're already doing what the other side is doing. So it's important that we reiterate the relevancy of this ethics at this stage. It's not just idealistic, it's proper to our democratic processes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, one at the front here.
Could I ask a question? I'm Andrew Briggs from the Materials Department here. Can I ask a question about the goals that the AI is doing, the score function that it set? And there's a technical question, which is to what extent the goal of the AI machine itself is vulnerable to cyber attack, so that the enemy might reset the goal of the whole system. Indeed, have there been cases of that? But then there's also a more philosophical question, which relates to your distinction between strategic and tactical aims. So you might have a commander who thinks that they are setting the strategic aims of the AI, and the AI, because of its amazing capabilities, might be then devising AI-generated tactical goals. If that distinction between the strategic and the tactical is valid, and it doesn't have to be on the battlefield, it can be AI doing sub-goals in pursuit of a bigger goal. How robust is that distinction between goals and sub-goals, between strategic and tactical?
So I would do something a bit impolite and flip it. It's not robust at all. I don't think that at the deployment stage, that distinction, not the distinction between strategic and tactic, but the distinction between goals and sub-goals, it's as evident as we would think it should be. And that's one of the aspects of control, because it's very hard to understand that this happens, for example, when you give an instructions but if you don't control the sub-goals, then you don't control the end goal. So it's another factor that plays into the fact that we don't control these technologies as we think we do and as we should. So yes, I agree with you.
And have there been cyber attacks on the goals of the big AI system?
I think so. No, I don't have access to any classified material, so I only answer on information that you and I might be able to access. I was reading this paper today precisely about this, LLMs doing this, and there's a paper on ArchivX that shows precisely this, that you can attack the goals and then the sub-goals of AI systems. So there is evidence of it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. My name is Alina. I'm a student at the Oxford Internet Institute. You spoke about the use of tech for warfare, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on sort of this emerging field of peace tech, whether that's tools for mediators to predict next most likely paths for conflict, or things like web scraping and computer hearing in sort of a context where conflict parties might have a monopoly of information flows.
So the expert on the topic is sitting in the row in front of you. Is Fiona, is doing a master on this topic, exactly. So I am less qualified than she is. But no, there is a lot of work done in that area. It's not necessarily done by defense forces or military institutions. It's more done at UN level of other sides of, let's say, government. I would say that you remember that there was a big, it's much less popular now, but the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals for AI, peace and stability was the tiny little 17th goal that nobody really looked at. There are initiatives in this side. I'll say just one thing, that when we use AI for good, as if for peace, that use of AI is not immune to the ethical risks I was mentioning before. You still have biases, you still have the erosion of human responsibility. So it's not a use that we should foster uncritically. It is important, but we also have to be concerned about the risks there, which can be harmful. I mean, there are evidences of AI biasing some forms of languages, or protocols be developed in some languages and not others, and then missing the nuances when you're trying to translate it. And then in delicate processes like peacemaking, for example, or peace negotiation can be very problematic. But I have to wait for Fiona to finish her thesis to be able to answer better to this question.
Actually, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who introduced the Sustainable Development Goals, Ban Ki-moon, is the latest person to be made a fellow of this college. So he'll be speaking in this very room on May the 2nd, Thursday, May the 2nd. So do come along and you can follow up on that question there. So, in the meantime, any more questions on? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I'm Andreas. I have a background in fact-checking in science communication. And I'm wondering how this translates to information warfare. And if, like, the act of, for example, spreading disinformation, which we've known is sometimes like state mediated, can that be considered an act of war, or how do you look at that?
It's a it's a very important question. So when I was designing these slides, I thought about introducing also the other element, but it seemed that would have been a little bit too much. We got it, but it's also a question of conceptual framing. The West has got this side of information warfare completely wrong. The one who got it correctly are the Russians, which are the one who are using it appropriately. I mean, not appropriately, but to the full potential. They have something called the Gerasimov doctrine. Now, Gerasimov has become famous lately because of all the involvement in this horrible war in Ukraine. But he wrote a newspaper article a few years ago where he showed that the digital is not just the digital. The digital is part of an environment which is made of information. And information cuts across all possible domains. It's within the analog, within the cyber. And he said, we on a newspaper, so it's not a hidden strategy somewhere, that to attack the West or the opponent, you need to tackle information across the domains. And so they have understood this fundamentally hybrid nature of reality by focusing on the common element. So indeed, information warfare or propaganda is part of adversarial tactics, is part of those adversarial tactics that don't have physical damage, but they tamper with sovereignty, for example, of a state, because if you fiddle with the election processes of a country, you are violating their sovereignty. But we haven't captured that in this way because of the cultural way to which we approach the technology, with a clear-cut divide, digital, non-digital. It's not there anymore. It's not. If Luciano Floridi was here, he would tell you that we live a non-life, constantly on and off life. No? So you hear and then you are on Facebook. How we miss that, I don't know. Or if if I'm cynical, I know. But if I'm not cynical, I don't know. The opponent hasn't. So.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear the cyber side of all these aspects of warfare. I was just really interested in that part when you were talking about decision support systems and human over-reliance on machine outputs. And so when it comes to a lot of military doctrines, when it comes to NATO or US, UK, they all talk about human in the loop, and the responsibility of having humans in the decision-making system, especially when it comes to strategic decisions. So when we are so reliant, and also we look at machines' output as something very objective, where do you think that that we should place where we should place responsibility when it comes to the decision-making cycles? How do we make sure that this human in the loop actually works out, and when we see an output from a machine, let's say it suggests a specific type of course of action, we don't over-rely on what the machine basically suggested to the humans, and what does actual responsible human in the loop design means?
Okay, so one element which would be mentioned in any answer to your question, which is very interesting, is that you need to have a human who's knowledgeable about AI processes, that looks at this technology not like a magic box, but a tool that has its pro and contra, its advantages and its flaws. I think that's correct, but it's only part of the answer. And if you focus too much on this, you go back to the ethics of evolution, where you devolve too much on the local user, whether it's a military person or not, to make all sorts of decisions that the institution are not thought about. Why I'm saying this? Well, it's because the use of a machine like this, given the tech problem in high-risk domain, has to come with a set of policies that I haven't seen yet, that are able to allow the human to do differently. If you don't have those sorts of policies, there is no worth asking questions about responsibility or critical use, because the incentive is to do what the machine asks to do, says to do. So this is one element. The other element is that now more responsibility in defense is very problematic, and one could think that moral responsibility goes across the chain of command. So, but that's not true. That's not correct, because we're talking about moral responsibility. We're not talking about liability. So, it's what the post-traumatic syndrome shows us, that even if you do something in response to an order, that has an impact on your moral character as a person. So, if we want to protect moral defense forces, we have to find a way where the moral responsibility is not discharged on them in a non-justified way. I think that we have to shift our way of thinking, and somewhere I talked about a moral gambit, where you take a gambit that things might go wrong and you accept it. And so, but it's more complicated than not for 6 p.m. Or 7 p.m. In a college night. But it's a huge problem. Just to say that it's a huge problem that cuts across a lot of high-risk domain. It's the same question in hospitals. Doctors have an issue in relying on technologies if there is no protocol that allows them to disagree in a safe way. So yes, spot on.
Thank you. I was wondering, from an ethicist perspective, how would you like to see technical research going forward, and do you see those two worlds as closely enough connected?
So I was telling before that I taught in computer science the first course in Computer Science Society, which is the first course on ethics and computer science in Oxford. And we don't know with Stanford whether we are the first or the second, but that's the level. And the first year I taught the course, it was about 8 students. There were 30 at the end of it. So I think that the ethical questions are there for the people who work in tech. They are just not expressly there, and they are less and less so. I mean, I think it's different now. So I think the two sectors are converging. When it comes to AI specifically, the focus I would like to see are on the robustness and security of this technology, because that that facilitates the control. So the more robust and secure it is, the more we can control it. I should say transparency as an ethicist, because that's the thing. But actually, I think transparency is not an issue solved only through technical means. Efficiency from a sustainable point of view, that's the other concern I have. Not because of defense, but AI is something which has a huge bearing on the environment. So making it more sustainable would be another element that I would be happy to see at some point.
Thank you. This is something that perhaps colleagues from OII have looked into, some sort of cloud empires, data empires, and how there is an increasing blurriness between the role of the state and private sector actors, right? So as most of the compute, the functional models required for AI development are increasingly dominated by private sector actors, how do you see the responsibility being distributed between the private sector actors and the state, particularly in developing ethical principles, but most importantly, the translation of those principles into effective tools that can be used to, regulate the use of AI, perhaps in cyberspace? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think that there are two answers to your question. One is that the relation between the public and the private sector when it comes to tech is regulated by procurement. And procurement, when it comes to certain domains, should be, I think, become much more open to societal damage and societal risks. And I don't think we are there yet. To the second question, it varies with the domain of use. Now, in Europe, we have, for example, the AI Act, which mandates for a number of certifications, which are de facto an implementation of the AI ethics principles. And that's actually, it's the European Union set a regulation. Companies need to set up a process. There are consultancies who are, creating a new market. Then there is a different, let's say, approach when it comes to high-risk domain. When it comes to defense, health, administration of justice, in those domains where the decisions of AI have a severe impact on the rights, can have a severe or a more severe impact on the rights of citizens, states need to be much more present, because the only way those principles are going to maintain their legitimacy is if they are implemented through the kind of multi-stakeholder, scrutable approach I was mentioning before. And that process needs to be independent. And that independence has to be guaranteed by a state institution. So states need to be more present there. The point with these principles is that they are all voluntary. So you might as well say it's reliable and governable and human-centric. Tomorrow you change your mind. we need some kind of guarantees in that context. So states need to be much more proactive and there's been a lot of debate. You talk about Billy's work and cloud, and this is all work that is also related to state sovereignty. Now, state sovereignty is understood in terms of territoriality, but is also understood in terms of how you enforce your own regulation as a state. And this should be one domain where you cannot enforce ethics, but you can force people to be serious about ethics, and so mandate all that process. So this is the way I see it, with a state which is much more present in that context. And I talk about state and non-government because this is another distinction we might want to go in at some point. But yeah, I hope it answered your question. But much more present state than we've seen so far.
More questions? If not, then we can continue them in a minute over drinks. Just pull that up. I'll say one more thing about the imitation game being unrealistic and Hollywoodized. One or two of you have heard this before, which is my father was one of the code breakers at Bletchley Park, and him and Alan Turing used to go to the pub once a week to play chess, not because either of them were any good, because they weren't, but so they could discuss whether or not they could build a machine that would be able to not only play chess, but learn as it did so, and that was the beginning of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and robotics. So what I think is the most egregious error in that film is that when they have the scene of Alan Turing in the pub playing chess, it would have been with my father, not with Keira Knightley. But please, everyone, join me. Well, you can come along and ask your questions directly to our speaker. It's absolutely fantastic, amazingly thoughtful presentation of all the issues. So please join me in thanking our speaker very much indeed. Thank you.